June Whitaker's son came home with a buyer, a contract, and a look on his face that told her he had already made peace with breaking her heart. The honey house stood behind her kitchen, leaning slightly toward the orchard like an old woman listening for a voice. 400 beehives sat beyond it in crooked rows, white boxes worn by rain, sun, and 22 Missouri winters. To everyone else, they were a burden. To June, they were the last thing her husband had trusted her to protect. "Mom," Daniel said softly, "you can't keep living like this." He pointed to the roof patch above the pantry, the unpaid tax letter clipped to the refrigerator, and the medicine bottles lined beside the sink. Then he pointed through the window toward the hives. "That is not a future. It's a memory." June looked out at the bees moving through the low afternoon light. They rose and settled in slow golden threads, crossing the yard the way Harold used to cross it before his knees failed. For one weak moment, she almost believed her son. Then the orchard company's representative laid a check on the kitchen table and said his crew could clear the honey house by Friday. June did not touch the money. She folded the contract once, slid it back across the table, and whispered, "Your father died telling me those queens were not for sale." By the end of the month, that same company would be begging her for just one. If stories about old promises, forgotten work, and things the world is too quick to throw away mean something to you, consider subscribing. Because this story was not just about bees, an old widow, or a failing orchard. It was about a truth still alive inside 400 wooden boxes. The buyer's name was Clayton Voss, and he wore the kind of smile men used when they had already decided an old woman was the only thing standing between them and a clean transaction. He sat at June Whitaker's kitchen table in polished boots, Hawthorne Fruit Company stitched across his jacket, a check laid neatly beside the salt shaker, as if money could be made to look like kindness. Daniel stood near the sink with his arms folded, trying not to look at it. June saw him look anyway. The kitchen gave away too much. A brown water stain spread above the stove. The screen door would not shut unless lifted by the handle. By the sink sat a jar of coins, 3 medicine bottles, and 3 envelopes turned face down so no visitor could read the red print across the front. Clayton had noticed every bit of it. "We're prepared to make this simple," he said. "We'll cover removal, clean the rear parcel, and handle the county paperwork. You won't have to worry about inspections anymore." June kept both hands folded over a dish towel. Her fingers were bent from years of lifting frames, scraping wax, and tying hive lids before storms. A dark smear of propolis clung to her thumbnail. Clayton looked at it, then looked away. "Mom," Daniel said quietly, "please listen to him." Outside the window, the honey house leaned in the spring light, its roof patched with tin Harold had salvaged years ago. Beyond it, 400 white hives sat in uneven rows, not pretty, not modern, not efficient, at least not to men who only trusted things that came with contracts and logos. But alive. "Harold marked those queens himself," June said. Clayton nodded with careful patience, the kind people used when they meant to indulge memory without giving it weight. "I respect the sentimental value." June lifted her eyes to him. "No," she said. "You respect the acreage." Daniel winced. "Mom." Clayton's smile thinned, but his voice stayed smooth. "Mrs. Whitaker, Hawthorne has brought in certified commercial hives for the valley, inspected stock, transported under contract. We're building a modern pollination system. Your boxes may have history, but they're no longer necessary." Necessary. The word struck harder than June expected. For 38 years, she had watched Harold read bees the way other men read weather reports. He knew a queenless hive by sound. He knew blossom would open by the smell in the air. He had walked those rows with a smoker in one hand and pain in both knees because, as he liked to say, bees did not wait for people to be ready. Now, Clayton Voss had reduced all of that to something unnecessary. Daniel pointed toward the unpaid tax letter. "The taxes are due in 9 days. The roof won't last another winter, and Dr. Ellman said your eye can't keep waiting." That was the cruelest part. Daniel was not wrong. He was not greedy. He had driven 4 hours after work to fix her pipes. He had paid for prescriptions without telling her. He was trying to save his mother. But the only way he knew how was to sell the last thing his father had begged her to protect. "This offer expires Friday," Clayton said, sliding the check closer. June did not touch it. By Thursday evening, the matter had moved to the Orchard Cooperative Hall. Growers filled the folding chairs. County staff lined the wall, Clayton clicked through bright slides showing maps, projected yields, liability zones, and June's property from above, flattened into colored blocks and useful numbers. A few heads turned toward her. Someone whispered, 400 old boxes. Surprised they haven't swarmed the school bus. A small laugh moved through the room. Daniel's jaw tightened. Clayton lifted a hand as if to calm the joke, but not before the laughter had finished doing its work. No one questions Mrs. Whitaker's history, he said. But we do have to separate memory from management. June sat still in Harold's old denim jacket, her purse on her lap. Inside it, the corner of his bee ledger pressed against the leather. Memory from management. That was how they buried things now. Not with dirt, with language. She stood. The room quieted, though not kindly. It was the strained quiet of people expecting an old woman to confirm their suspicions by saying something foolish in public. Clayton blinked. Mrs. Whitaker? June walked to the front more slowly than she wanted to. Her knee ached. She took Harold's ledger from her purse and laid it on the table. The cover was cracked. The spine was held with tape. A young grower snorted. June rested one hand on it. My husband did not leave me boxes, she said. He left me queens. Clayton gave the same polite smile he had worn in her kitchen. Queens can be replaced. June looked at him for a long moment. Not these. Outside, spring wind moved through the orchard rows. Blossoms trembled on the branches. Open and waiting for work no machine could do. Harold said never to sell them to people who only count fruit. No one laughed loudly this time. But they still did not believe her. That would come later, when the imported hives began to die. Before anyone in the valley knew June Whitaker as the woman with too many beehives. She had been the girl who could not stand the sound of them. The first time Harold brought her to his father's bee yard, she stayed behind the truck with both hands tucked under her arms. She was 21, newly married, wearing white canvas shoes too clean for farm life. The air smelled of clover, smoke, and warm wax. Bees moved everywhere, not like a cloud, but like 1,000 small decisions happening at once. Harold laughed softly when he saw her face. Don't watch the swarm, he said. Listen to the box. June told him she could not hear anything except trouble. So Harold placed one bare hand on the side of a hive and waited. After a moment, he motioned for her to do the same. The wood was warm. Beneath it, something low and steady trembled through her palm. That's a good queen, Harold said. When she's right, the whole house knows what to do. June did not understand it then, but she remembered his face. They began with 12 hives behind a rented farmhouse outside Larkspur Bend, Missouri. Harold repaired orchard equipment during the day and worked bees in the evening. June kept books for a feed store until Daniel was born, then learned to stretch money until it could see daylight through itself. There were years when the bees paid the property tax. Years when they paid for Daniel's winter coat. Years when honey jars lined every windowsill because prices had collapsed, and Harold refused to sell to a bottler who mixed local honey with syrup. He was stubborn about small things, because he believed small things were where people first practiced dishonesty. June used to tease him for that. Then she learned he was usually right. The honey house came later, built from salvaged lumber, bent nails, and Harold's belief that anything worth keeping deserved a dry roof. He set the workbench beneath the east window because morning light showed wax color better than any bulb. He hung queen cages from labeled nails and wrote everything down in black ledger books. Dates, weather, bloom times, temperament, losses, splits, swarms, and growers who paid late but paid honestly. Daniel grew up with that smell in his clothes. By 10, he could light a smoker without choking. By 12, he could spot drone brood. By 15, he wanted nothing more to do with any of it. I don't want to spend my life getting stung for people who still pay Dad late, he said. Harold did not scold him. He only looked toward the hives and nodded. Then don't, Harold said. But don't hate the bees for what people do. Daniel left after high school for Kansas City, where work had steady checks and no weather that could ruin a year overnight. June never blamed him, but she felt Harold grow quieter after that. Not angry, just quieter. The worst spring came 11 years later. The apples bloomed early. Too early, Harold said. Warm March days pushed the valley into false confidence. Trucks moved down orchard roads before sunrise. Sprayers ran late into the evening. Men talked about yield projections at the diner, as if the trees had already handed them money. Then the bees began to die. Not all at once, June found the first pile outside Hive 17, a small, trembling crescent of bodies on the landing board. Harold crouched for a long time and said nothing. The next morning there were more. By the third day, 3 other beekeepers had called. By the end of the week, June stopped putting the receiver back in its cradle. Harold drove from yard to yard with jars, bags, and a cooler full of wax samples. He came home after dark, his face gray with dust and worry. June watched him spread dead bees across white paper under the honey house light. Their legs were drawn tight. Their wings looked clean. That frightened him more than if they had looked diseased. "It isn't mites," he said. The county extension office said otherwise. Or weather, or stress, or weak stock. The words changed depending on who was asking, but the meaning stayed the same. No one with authority wanted to say spray drift. No one wanted to point at the contractor hired by the largest orchard group in the valley. No one wanted to admit that a mistake made in one windy hour could bankrupt families who had spent decades building queens. Harold tried anyway. For months, he wrote letters, sent samples, asked for records, and drove to meetings where men in pressed shirts explained bees to him as if he had not lived with them for half his life. June went with him twice. The second time, she watched Earl Maddox from the extension office refuse to meet Harold's eyes. That was the first time she saw her husband truly afraid. Not afraid of losing money. They had done that before. Afraid that the truth could be known and still not matter. The official report came in July. Weather collapse. Transport stress. Inconsistent hive management among small operators. Small operators. June remembered Harold reading those words at the kitchen table. His hands did not shake. That was how she knew he was furious. 3 beekeepers sold their equipment before winter. 1 family left the valley. Another lost their home. Harold said little. But the ledger books changed after that. He no longer recorded only queens and bloom times. He wrote names, dates, wind direction, failed yards, surviving yards, quiet payments, and families who received nothing. June asked him once what he planned to do with all of it. "Keep it alive," he said. She thought he meant the bees. Years passed. Big orchards swallowed small ones. Harold's knees failed. June began lifting frames he could no longer lift, pretending not to see how it hurt him. When Harold was dying, he asked for the ledger from the honey house. June brought it to the bedroom and laid it beside him. Daniel stood in the doorway, frightened by his father's silence. Harold took June's wrist. "Don't sell the queens," he whispered. "Not to them." Then he pressed one finger against the ledger. "If they come for them," he breathed, "make them remember." For 7 years, June obeyed the part she understood. She kept the hives. She mended lids. She replaced frames. She paid fees when she could, and delayed them when she could not. She let Daniel think grief had made her stubborn because the truth was harder to explain. Now, after the cooperative meeting, June sat alone in the honey house, with Harold's ledger open beneath the east window. The old pages smelled of wax and dust. She turned past Queen notes and winter losses until she reached the section Harold had marked with a strip of blue cloth. There were names there. Not hive names, people's names. And beside each one, in Harold's careful handwriting, a date, a yard number, and one word repeated again and again. Spray. By Friday morning, June Whitaker's Beehives had become a problem with a file number. Pamela Keene returned just after 9, driving a county pickup with a cracked windshield and a yellow inspection folder on the passenger seat. She parked by the lane, not too close to the hives, and sat for a moment before getting out. June saw that. People who were afraid of bees parked far away. People who respected them waited before stepping into their path. Pamela did both. "I'm not here to make this harder than it has to be," she said. June stood beside the honey house door with her veil folded over one arm. "That's what people say when the paper already has its mind made up." Pamela looked tired. "The paper doesn't. The county does." Behind Pamela, Daniel leaned against his truck, hands in his jacket pockets. He had stayed after the meeting, sleeping badly on June's couch, waking twice when the wind rattled the loose screen door. He had not apologized for bringing Clayton Voss to the house. June had not asked him to. Some wounds needed room before they would show their true shape. Pamela opened the yellow folder. The issue is active management documentation, setback distance from the access lane, and liability related to outdated hive equipment. June glanced toward the rows. Outdated. That word seemed to follow old things around like a stray dog. The hives were not beautiful. June knew that better than anyone. Their paint was peeling. Some lids were patched with feed can tin. Bricks held down the covers on the west row where wind came hard across the orchard. A few bottom boards had been replaced with mismatched lumber. One hive body still bore the faint blue number Harold had painted on it before Daniel was born. But June could tell you which colonies had wintered heavy, which queens laid tight patterns, which boxes needed room before swarm season, which hive sounded restless, which one sounded queen-right. Clayton Voss would see 400 wooden boxes. June saw 400 houses. "May I inspect the records?" Pamela asked. June opened the honey house. The smell came out first. Warm wax. Smoke. Old pine. Honey stored in wood for so long it seemed to have entered the walls. Daniel looked away as if the smell had reached something in him before he could stop it. Inside, everything appeared old until a person looked closely. The smoker was blackened but clean. The hive tools hung in size order above the bench. Empty queen cages were grouped by year in coffee cans. Stacks of frames sat beneath cloth covers. Jars of wax flakes caught morning light on the shelf. Along the east wall, Harold's ledgers rested in a row, each spine marked by year. Pamela stepped inside, then paused. "This is more organized than the file suggests." June almost smiled. "The file never came in here." Daniel ran a hand across the workbench. "Dad built this from the old feed store lumber." "I remember," June said. It was the first soft thing either of them had said since Clayton's visit. Pamela studied the wall of ledgers. "These are your management records?" "Some of them." "Some?" June took down the most recent ledger. "The bees don't care which form the county prefers." Pamela did not laugh, but her mouth changed slightly. June opened the book to spring notes. The pages were filled with Harold's old system continued in June's smaller hand. Queen age, temperament, brood pattern, mite check, honey stores, splits, bloom timing, flight behavior, weather change, orchard placement. Besides some hive numbers were tiny marks in blue pencil. Pamela leaned closer. "What are those?" "Queen line. Genetic tracking? That's one word for it." Pamela looked up. "What's another?" June closed the ledger halfway. "Memory." Outside, a truck turned into the lane. Daniel looked through the dirty window and muttered, "Of course." Clayton Voss stepped out with two men June did not recognize. One wore a Hawthorne vest, the other carried a tablet and kept his eyes on the hives as if already measuring them for removal. Clayton approached with the same polished concern he had brought into June's kitchen. "Mrs. Whitaker, Pamela, I hope we're not interrupting." "You are," June said. Clayton's smile held. Pamela closed her folder. "This is a county inspection, and Hawthorne is an affected neighboring operator," Clayton said smoothly. "We just want to make sure everyone understands the risks." June could feel Daniel tense beside her. Clayton walked toward the nearest row of hives, but stopped short when several bees crossed in front of him. He tried to pretend he had stopped to observe. "They're defensive," he said. "They're working," June replied. The man with the tablet crouched near one hive, snapped a photograph, and pointed at the patched lid. "This equipment won't meet commercial standard." "It isn't commercial equipment," June said. Clayton turned. "That's exactly the issue. Hawthorne can offer a clean solution. We remove the liability, compensate you fairly, and preserve any stock that might still have practical value." June looked at him. "Preserve." "Yes," Clayton said. "If there is a viable queen line here, we would consider maintaining it under controlled conditions." There it was. Not the boxes. Not the honey house. Not Harold's workbench, or the ledgers or the hands that had kept the bees alive through hard winters. The queen line. Daniel heard it too. His eyes moved from Clayton to June. "How much?" he asked before he could stop himself. Clayton did not answer directly. Men like him rarely did when silence could raise the price in another person's mind. "We're prepared to discuss a separate valuation," he said. "If Mrs. Whitaker can document the line's survival traits." Pamela's eyes sharpened. June felt the old ledger under her palm. For a moment, the whole morning seemed to tilt. The tax letter on the refrigerator, the leak over the pantry, the gray blur at the edge of her left eye, Daniel's tired face, Clayton's careful words. Separate valuation. That meant real money, maybe enough to save the house, maybe enough to make Daniel stop looking at her like love had become a debt he could not pay. One hive near the honey house gave a low, even hum. June turned toward it before anyone else noticed. Hive 43. Harold had always said that number as if it belonged to more than bees. Clayton followed her gaze. "That one?" he asked. June said nothing. He smiled. And in that smile, June understood something cold and simple. He did not know what he was buying, but he knew enough to want it before anyone else did. Pamela stepped between Clayton and the hive row. "No stock is being removed during this inspection." Clayton's eyes stayed on June. "Of course." But the tone in his voice said Friday was not the real deadline anymore. The real deadline was the moment he learned what Hive 43 meant. After they left, Daniel remained outside with June. He did not mention the check. He did not mention the roof. He looked at the rows of old white boxes as if, for the first time in years, they were not merely his father's unfinished burden. "What's special about that hive?" he asked. June watched bees enter and leave through the narrow slit of the landing board. "I used to think it was the queen," she said. Daniel turned to her. "And now?" June looked back toward the honey house, where Harold's ledgers waited in the smell of wax and smoke. "Now I think your father left me too little truth and too much responsibility." June went to the county office the next morning with Harold's ledger wrapped in a dish towel. Daniel Droveher. He said it was because her left eye was getting worse, but June knew that was only half the truth. The other half was that he wanted to see, with his own eyes, whether his father's old book could actually protect anything. The county agriculture office sat at the edge of Larkspur Bend, between the license bureau and a farm supply store that now sold more lawn equipment than feed. June had been there many times over the years, usually to renew forms, pay late fees, or argue over rules written by people who had never tried to move hives before a thunderstorm. But that morning felt different. Pamela Keene met them at the counter, not behind her desk. That small choice told June the news would not be good. "I reviewed what you showed me yesterday," Pamela said. Daniel straightened. "And?" Pamela looked at the dish towel under June's arm. "Your records are detailed, more detailed than I expected. But they don't replace current registration forms, inspection certificates, setback compliance, or proof of commercial liability coverage." June held still. "The bees are alive," she said. "The queens are tracked. The yards are marked." "I know," Pamela said. "But the county doesn't certify memory." A man, waiting near the copy machine, snorted. June turned. He was young, maybe 35, with a seed cap, a phone in his hand, and the impatient look of someone used to laughing before thinking. She recognized him as Travis Boone, whose family had leased part of their orchard block to Hawthorne the year before. "Sorry," he said, not sounding sorry. "It's just funny. Everybody else has software now, and Mrs. Whitaker brought a scrapbook." Daniel's face hardened. "It's not a scrapbook." Travis raised both hands. "Didn't say it was bad, just old." The word landed softly, which somehow made it worse. June unwrapped the ledger and placed it on the counter. "Old is not the same as useless." "No, ma'am," Travis said. "But bees don't read paperwork either." The clerk behind the counter looked down quickly. Someone in the hall gave a short laugh. Pamela did not smile. "That's enough." But enough had already happened. June opened the ledger to the pages marked in blue pencil. She showed Pamela hive numbers, queen replacements, mite checks, spring splits, and notes Harold had begun before his hands failed. Pamela took photographs for the file. She did it carefully, respectfully, but June could tell respect would not stop a removal order if Hawthorne pushed hard enough. "What do I need?" Daniel asked. Pamela handed him a printed checklist: updated registration, site map, setback correction, proof of active inspection, insurance, and if Hawthorne widens that lane, several hives may have to be moved within 10 days. 10 days? Daniel said. "That's the minimum before enforcement review." June looked at the checklist. It was only one sheet of paper. Strange how a single sheet could weigh more than 400 boxes. On the way out, Travis Boone was standing by his truck with 2 other growers. One of them nodded toward June's ledger. "You ought to put that thing online," he said. "Maybe the bees will subscribe." The men laughed. Daniel stopped walking. June touched his sleeve. "No." He looked at her, angry and ashamed. "You're just going to let them talk like that? I've heard worse from men who owed us money. That doesn't make it right." "No," June said. "But right is not what we came here to collect." They drove next to Earl Maddox's place. Earl lived 6 miles outside town in a low brick house, surrounded by pecan trees and old extension office plaques he had never thrown away. June had not been inside since Harold's funeral. Earl had come late that day, stood near the back of the church, and left before the food was served. He opened the door only halfway. When he saw the ledger in June's hands, his face changed. Not much, just enough. "June," he said. "Daniel, we need to ask you about the old report," June said. Earl's eyes moved toward the road, as if someone might be listening from the ditch. That was a long time ago. So were most things that still hurt people. Daniel glanced at his mother. He had never heard that edge in her voice before. Earl stepped onto the porch but did not invite them in. His hair had gone thin and white, and his hands trembled slightly around the doorframe. The report said weather collapse. June said, "That is what the available evidence supported." Harold said the evidence was changed. Earl's jaw tightened. Harold said many things when he was grieving. June opened the ledger. The blue cloth marker fluttered in the porch wind. She turned to the page with Hive 43 and the Queen line notations. Earl looked down. For 1 second, all the color left his face. Daniel saw it. June saw him seeing it. "What does that mark mean?" Daniel asked. Earl stepped back. "You shouldn't be carrying that around." June's hand tightened on the book. "Why?" "Because people will misunderstand it." "Then explain it." Earl looked past her toward the pecan trees. "Leave it alone, June." "No." His voice dropped. Harold should have left it alone, too. The words sat between them like a door suddenly opened onto a dark room. Before June could ask another question, a truck engine growled from the road. A Hawthorne service vehicle passed slowly, hauling stacked commercial hives on a flatbed. The boxes were clean, uniform, strapped tight in perfect rows. Clayton Voss followed in a second truck, speaking into a phone, not even looking toward Earl's house. Earl watched the trucks disappear. "They're moving fast," he said. "So should you," June replied. But Earl only shook his head. "You don't know what opening this will cost." June thought of the tax letter. The roof. Daniel's tired eyes. The blur growing at the edge of her vision. "I already know what silence costs," she said. Earl closed the door gently, which somehow felt worse than if he had slammed it. That afternoon, the commercial hives arrived at Hawthorne's main orchard in a procession of trucks, forklifts, and men wearing reflective vests. Clayton had made sure people saw it. Growers gathered along the service road. A local reporter took photographs. Someone joked that this was what pollination looked like when it finally joined the century. June stood across the fence with Daniel. Her own hives sat far behind them, crooked and patched, invisible from the road. Clayton spotted her and walked over. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said pleasantly, loud enough for others to hear. "You're welcome to observe. It might help ease your mind about the transition." A few growers smiled. Daniel shifted forward. But June answered first. "Bees don't transition because a man printed a schedule." Clayton's smile stayed, but his eyes cooled. "No, but farms do." The forklifts lowered pallet after pallet of commercial hives between the apple rows. The boxes looked strong and clean. The labels were new. The system looked impressive. June listened. Under the engine noise, under the men talking, under Clayton explaining transport protocols to the reporter, she searched for the sound Harold had taught her to hear. The hives were loud, but they were not steady. She did not say it. Not there. Not while the men waited for another reason to smile. Daniel leaned close. "What is it?" June watched a cluster of bees crawl in circles at the entrance of a new box, confused by a valley they did not know. "Nothing yet," she said. But that was not true. Something had already started. Only Hawthorne did not know how to hear it. The first dead bees appeared on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Hawthorne finished placing the commercial hives. A worker named Miles found them while checking irrigation heads in Block C. At first, he thought someone had spilled black seed near the pallets. Then he bent down and saw wings. Hundreds of bees lay scattered in the dust beneath the entrance boards, their bodies curled tight, legs drawn inward as if the ground had gone cold beneath them. He called his supervisor. By noon, 3 men were standing over the dead bees with clipboards. By 2, Clayton Voss had arrived. By 3, the explanation had already begun changing. "Transport stress," one technician said. "Temperature shift," said another. "Mites could have spiked before delivery." Clayton did not like that answer. These hives were certified. The technician looked at the dead bees, then at the orchard, rows heavy with blossom. Certified doesn't mean invincible. Clayton's face tightened. The apple trees did not care who was certified. They stood in long white rows, open and waiting. Blossoms only stayed ready for so long. Everyone in the valley knew that. You could miss rain and pray for another storm. You could miss a market price and wait for next year. But Bloom did not wait for pride, paperwork, or a service truck coming from 3 states away. By late afternoon, Daniel heard about it at the feed store. He drove straight to June's place. She was in the west row, lifting a frame from Hive 22. Bees moved over her gloves in calm, golden clusters. Daniel stopped several feet away, still uncomfortable around them after all those years. "Mom," he called, "something's happening at Hawthorne." June did not look up. "I know. How could you know?" She tilted the frame toward the light. "Because they're too loud." Daniel glanced toward the distant orchard as if sound could travel that far. "You haven't even been over there today." "I didn't need to be," he almost argued. Then he remembered the day Hawthorne unloaded the commercial hives, the way his mother had gone quiet while everyone else admired the clean white boxes. "What does too loud mean?" he asked. June slid the frame back into place. "A hive can make plenty of noise and still be wrong." That was the kind of sentence Daniel had hated as a teenager. It sounded like something meant to end a conversation instead of explain it. But this time, June did explain. She walked him to Hive 43. The box looked no different from the others, except for the faded blue mark on the corner. June lifted the outer cover carefully. The hum rose, deep and even, not angry, not panicked, but full. Daniel felt it in his chest before he admitted he heard it. "Listen," she said. He did. For a moment, he was 12 again, standing beside Harold in a veil too big for his face, pretending not to be impressed when his father could name a hive's trouble without opening it. June closed the lid. "That sound means they know where home is," she said. "They know the queen is right. They know what work belongs to them." Daniel looked toward Hawthorne's orchard. "And theirs don't?" "I don't know yet, but I know what confusion sounds like." The phone rang inside the house before he could answer. June let it ring 4 times. Daniel went in and picked it up. "Whitaker residence." He listened, then turned toward the window. "It's Pamela." June came inside slowly, taking off one glove, finger by finger. Pamela Keene's voice sounded different than it had at the county office. Less official, more careful. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, "I'm calling to ask whether you've seen any unusual hive behavior this week." June looked at Daniel. "No," she said. "Mine are flying steady." A pause. "Have you been near Hawthorne's Block C?" "No." Another pause. Pamela lowered her voice. "Several commercial hives are showing loss. Not total collapse, but enough that Hawthorne has requested emergency evaluation." June sat down at the kitchen table. Daniel remained standing. "What are they blaming?" June asked. "Transport stress right now." "And what do you think?" Pamela did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. "I think," she said at last, "that I'd like to take comparative notes from your yard tomorrow morning. Quietly, if possible." "County business?" June asked. "Not yet." June watched a bee crawl along the outside of the kitchen window, pause near the loose screen, then lift away. "All right," she said. After she hung up, Daniel stared at her. "You knew," he said. "I suspected, because of sound." "Because of sound, flight pattern, entrance behavior, and the way those boxes were placed." Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. "Why didn't you say something?" "To whom? Clayton?" June asked. "He did not come here to learn. He came here to remove." The next morning, Pamela arrived before sunrise. No county truck this time. She came in her own car, wearing old jeans, and carrying a plain notebook instead of a yellow folder. June noticed that and said nothing. Together, they walked the rows while Daniel followed with coffee he forgot to drink. June pointed without touching. "Hive 11 is light but stable. Needs feed if we get rain." Pamela wrote. "Hive 22 is building fast. I'll split it if the weather holds." Pamela wrote faster. "Hive 43, June said, stopping. "That one you don't move unless you have no other choice." Pamela looked up. "Why?" June's eyes went to the blue mark. "Because Harold didn't." That was all she offered. When the sun cleared the trees, the bees began to fly. Daniel had seen bees fly thousands of times as a boy, but he had never watched them the way he watched them that morning. They did not pour out wildly. They left in measured lines, turning once in the light, then heading toward the orchard edges and wild clover beyond the lane. Some returned dusted pale with pollen. Others vanished into the apple rows Hawthorne had not yet fenced off. Pamela closed her notebook. These colonies are stronger than the file suggests. June gave her a dry look. The file keeps missing things. Before Pamela could reply, Clayton's truck came fast down the lane. He stepped out without his usual smile. "Pamela," he said, "I was told you were conducting an inspection. I'm observing colony behavior." "On whose authority?" "My own professional concern." Clayton looked at June. "Convenient." Daniel stepped forward. "What happened in Block C?" Clayton's mouth tightened. "A manageable issue." June turned toward the orchard. "How many dead?" No one spoke. That silence changed the air. Clayton adjusted his jacket. "Mrs. Whitaker, Hawthorne may be willing to discuss a short-term placement of a limited number of your hives." Daniel looked at his mother. Pamela looked at Clayton. June did not move. 3 days earlier, he had wanted her boxes gone. Now he wanted them placed. That was not apology, but it was the first crack in certainty. "How many?" June asked. Clayton hesitated. "Enough to support the east blocks while our supplier sends replacements." June shook her head. "You don't understand bees if you think replacements arrive like spark plugs." Clayton's face flushed. Daniel expected the growers, standing near the lane, to laugh at June again. They did not. This time, they were looking past Clayton toward the orchard, where white petals had begun gathering under the nearest apple trees. Not many, just enough to notice. June saw them. So did Daniel. The blossoms were falling too soon. For the first time since he had brought Clayton into her kitchen, Daniel looked at the old hives behind his mother and did not see a burden. He saw time, and they were running out of it. By the second morning of falling blossoms, Hawthorne stopped calling it manageable. They still did not call it failure. Companies had softer words for failure. They called it disruption, stress response, delivery inconsistency, environmental pressure. Clayton Voss used all of them during the emergency meeting in the orchard office while men stood outside brushing dead bees from the pallets with gloved hands. But everyone could see the trees. The east blocks were turning white at the wrong end of spring. Petals gathered under the branches in thin, accusing drifts. A blossom on the tree meant possibility. A blossom on the ground meant time had run out. Pamela Keene arrived with her county truck this time. That mattered. Clayton noticed it before June did. "You're here officially?" he asked. "I'm here because pollination failure across this many acres becomes a county concern," Pamela said. Clayton's jaw worked once. "We have replacements coming." "From where?" "Arkansas, maybe Oklahoma." "When?" He did not answer. June stood near the service road with Daniel beside her. She had not wanted to come. She had especially not wanted to stand within sight of the same men who had laughed at Harold's ledger. But Pamela had called before sunrise and said, "If your hives can help, I need to see it with my own eyes." That was different from Clayton asking. So June came. Clayton walked toward her with the expression of a man stepping over pride because the floor beneath it had collapsed. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "Hawthorne would like to discuss temporary placement." June looked across the rows. The imported hives sat between the trees, clean and square, but strangely lifeless in the morning light. Some bees crawled along the entrances. Few lifted. "How many blocks are dropping?" she asked. Clayton hesitated. Pamela answered, 5, showing measurable loss. 2 critical. June turned to Clayton. "And now you want my old boxes." "I want to protect the crop." "No," June said. "You want to borrow what you tried to erase." Daniel looked at her sharply. It was not a loud sentence, but it changed the men around them. No one smiled. Clayton swallowed whatever answer he had prepared. "Name your terms." June's terms were not complicated. No hive would be moved without her present. No queen would be removed. Pamela would record every placement. Hawthorne would sign a written statement that the Whitaker hives were being used for emergency pollination support, not transferred, sold, or evaluated for private ownership, and Hive 43 would not move. Clayton objected to the last part first. That hive may be the strongest line. That is why it stays. We need strength in the east blocks. You need bees that know the valley, June said, not the one hive you think you can name a price for. Pamela wrote the terms. Daniel watched her write them, then looked at his mother as if he had missed an entire language in the house where he grew up. By noon, June's first 30 hives were placed along the east edge of the orchard. It was not dramatic at first. No miracle happened. The petals did not leap back onto the trees. The dead bees did not rise. The men who had expected an instant sign shifted impatiently from foot to foot. June ignored them. She waited beside the row with her smoker unlit in one hand. "Now?" Daniel asked. Soon. The first bees emerged slowly, orienting themselves in short circles. Then more followed. They rose, turned toward the light, and began to cross into the apple rows. Not wildly, not confused. Steady. By mid-afternoon, workers began noticing the difference. The east edge had sound again. Not engine sound. Not voices. Not the brittle noise of men pretending control. A low, living hum moved through the nearest trees. Pamela stood under a branch and watched bees work the blossoms that had not yet fallen. She did not smile. She only closed her notebook and opened it again, as if the first set of notes had not been enough. Clayton walked the row twice without speaking. Daniel stood near June, hands in his pockets, eyes following the flight lines. "They're doing it," he said. June did not answer right away. Her left eye throbbed in the bright air. She could see the bees better if she turned her head slightly and used the right. "They're doing what bees do," she said. "People are the ones who forget." A truck slowed on the service road. June recognized Earl Maddox before he stepped out. He stood beside his old pickup for a long moment, watching the Whitaker hives in Hawthorne's orchard. He wore the same tan field jacket he had worn for 20 years. The collar frayed white, the zipper broken halfway up. In his hand was a manila envelope. Pamela saw him and stiffened. Clayton saw him and looked annoyed. June felt Daniel move closer. Earl walked toward them as if every step had been argued over before he took it. "I heard they moved your bees," he said. "Some," June replied. His eyes went down the line of hives. "Not 43. No." Something like relief passed across his face. June saw it. "You know why Harold marked that hive." Earl looked at Clayton, then Pamela, then Daniel. "I know why he started marking them." Clayton stepped in. "If this is about historical speculation, we have a crop emergency to manage." Earl gave him a tired look. "Son, this emergency started before you were born." The orchard seemed to quiet around that sentence. Earl handed the envelope to June, but his fingers did not let go immediately. "I should have given him this," he said. "Years ago." June opened the flap. Inside was a photocopy of an old lab receipt, yellowed at the edges, and a typed memo from the state extension lab. Daniel leaned over her shoulder. Pamela came closer. June read the first line twice because she did not trust her eyes. Wax sample residue inconsistent with weather-related colony collapse. Below it, another line had been underlined. Chemical exposure cannot be ruled out. Pamela's face changed. Clayton reached for the page. "May I see that?" June pulled it back. Earl's voice was low. "Harold sent samples after the spring losses. Wax, dead bees, pollen scrapings. The preliminary result did not match the report that went out." Pamela looked at him. "You had this?" "I had a copy, and the final report said weather collapse." Earl nodded. Clayton's voice sharpened. "A preliminary memo from decades ago does not prove anything." "No," Earl said. "But it proves someone knew there was another answer before they chose the easy one." June looked at him. For years, she had believed Harold had been angry because no one listened. Now she understood something worse. Someone had listened, then buried what they heard. Daniel took the memo gently from June's hand and read it again. His mouth parted slightly, not in shock alone, but in recognition. He was beginning to see his father not as a stubborn man defeated by grief, but as a man left holding a truth powerful people had stepped around. Earl wiped one hand down his face. "I told Harold to stop pushing," he said. "I told him he'd lose more than bees." June's voice was quiet. "And did he?" Earl looked toward the working hives. "No," he said. "The rest of us did." Across the orchard, the Whitaker bees moved from blossom to blossom, carrying life into trees Hawthorne had nearly lost. The men who had laughed at June's boxes stood watching them now, not grateful yet, not sorry, but silent. And for the first time, silence felt less like dismissal and more like fear. The offer came in a black folder. Not the plain white folder Clayton Voss had brought to June's kitchen. Not the county folder Pamela Keene carried with tired hands and clipped forms. This one was smooth, heavy, and stamped with Hawthorne Fruit Company's silver logo. Clayton did not bring it alone. He arrived 2 days after the East Blocks began to recover, followed by a woman in a charcoal suit who introduced herself as Marlene Price, regional counsel for Hawthorne's Agricultural Acquisitions Division. She did not look at the bees first. She looked at the house, the roof patch, the leaning gutter, the porch step Daniel had braced with scrap lumber the night before. Then she looked at June's left eye. June noticed. Lawyers were trained to see weak places. Daniel came out of the honey house wiping his hands on a rag. He had been helping June repair a cracked inner cover, though he still moved around the bees like a man apologizing with his shoulders. Clayton held the black folder out. "We'd like to make a serious proposal," he said. June did not take it. Serious came late. Marlene gave a polite smile. "Late does not mean insincere, Mrs. Whitaker. Hawthorne recognizes that your stock has unusual resilience. We are prepared to compensate you accordingly." Daniel's eyes moved toward the folder before he could stop them. June saw that too. They sat at the kitchen table because refusing to sit would not make the offer disappear. Marlene opened the folder and turned the first page. The number at the top made Daniel go still. It was more than the first check. Much more. Enough to pay the taxes. Enough to replace the roof. Enough to cover June's eye surgery, transportation, medicine, and a year of breathing room. Enough that, for one shameful second, June felt her heart reach for it. Marlene spoke gently. Hawthorne would purchase the queen line, all breeding rights, all related records necessary for propagation, and a non-disclosure agreement regarding historical claims not yet legally established. Pamela was not there to hear it. That was the first warning. Daniel looked up. "Non-disclosure?" Clayton answered before Marlene could. "To avoid confusion while we verify old materials. Preliminary documents can create unnecessary panic." June's hand rested near Harold's ledger, which lay closed on the table. "Panic for whom?" she asked. Marlene folded her hands. "Mrs. Whitaker, you have an opportunity to protect yourself. This house, your medical care, your remaining years. Public disputes are expensive. Agricultural claims from decades ago are difficult to prove. Even if you are right, you may not live to see resolution." Daniel flinched. June felt the sentence enter him. "Even if you are right, may not live." Marlene had not raised her voice. She did not need to. She had placed the cost on the table beside the money. Daniel stood and walked to the sink. "Mom," he said, not turning around, "we should think about this." June looked at the back of his neck. He sounded like a boy trying not to cry. Clayton softened his tone. "This doesn't erase Harold's work. It preserves it under professional management." "No," June said. "It makes it yours." Marlene slid a second sheet forward. "You would retain ceremonial recognition." June almost laughed. Ceremonial recognition. A plaque, perhaps. A line in a brochure. The old widow whose bees helped modern agriculture move forward. Harold reduced to a heritage story, his ledger locked behind corporate language. Daniel turned from the sink. "What happens if she says no?" Marlene did not look pleased by the question. "Then Hawthorne continues pursuing standard regulatory remedies regarding hive placement, access, liability, and crop impact." There it was, the smile on the knife. After they left, the kitchen seemed smaller. Daniel sat across from June with the offer between them. "You need surgery," he said. "I know. You need the roof fixed. I know. You could lose the hives anyway if the county pushes. I know that too." His voice broke. "Then what are we doing?" June did not answer quickly. Outside, the bees moved through evening light, steady and unaware of contracts. Daniel pressed both hands against the table. "Dad is gone. He doesn't have to live with the consequences. You do." The words hurt, because they were true in a way Daniel did not intend. Harold was gone. Harold had left her the ledger, the queens, the warning. But he had not left enough money to keep the roof dry. He had not left instructions for attorneys. He had not told her what to do when truth came with a price she could not pay. That night, June took the ledger into the honey house. She lit the work lamp above the bench. Its yellow glow fell across queen cages, hive tools, wax stains, and the old blue cloth marker Harold had tucked between pages. She opened to the line he had written before his hand became too weak. "If they come for them, make them remember." For 7 years, June had heard only one command in that sentence. Keep them. Keep the queens. Keep the boxes. Keep Harold's work away from people like Clayton Voss. But now, with Marlene's offer folded in her apron pocket and Daniel's words still raw in her chest, She wondered if she had mistaken keeping for hiding. What if Harold had not meant her to guard the bees forever? What if he had meant the bees to become proof? A truck door shut outside. June turned off the lamp. Through the honey house window, she saw Earl Maddox standing near the fence, hat in both hands. "You shouldn't be here at night," she called. "Neither should old sins," he answered. She opened the door. Earl looked smaller than he had in daylight. "Hawthorne knows there's more in that ledger than Queen notes." "How?" "Because I told one person too much a long time ago." June stared at him. Earl swallowed. The spray contractor had friends. The orchard group had lawyers. The final report wasn't just softened, June. It was redirected. "By you?" His face folded inward. "I signed what they put in front of me." June felt the air leave her. Earl lifted one trembling hand. "I told myself the preliminary memo wasn't enough. I told myself weather did play a part. I told myself if the valley collapsed, everybody would lose." "And the beekeepers?" He looked toward the dark rows of hives. "They lost first." For a moment, June wanted to shut the door in his face. Harold had died carrying anger this man had helped make. Families had left the valley under a lie. Daniel had grown up thinking bees made people poor when it had been people who had made the truth poor. But Earl reached into his coat and took out a small envelope. "There are more names," he said. "Not in the county file. Harold had some. Not all." June did not take it yet. "What is Hive 43? She asked. Earl closed his eyes. "The last surviving queen from Mercer Yard," he said. "After the spray." "Harold didn't tell you?" June's hand tightened around the door frame. Mercer Yard had not belonged to the Whitakers. It had belonged to a family that left Missouri before Daniel was grown. Earl opened his eyes. "June, those queens don't just carry Harold's work." He looked toward the hives. "They carry everybody he couldn't save." June did not sleep that night. She sat at the honey house bench, with Earl's envelope unopened beside Harold's ledger, listening to the hives breathe in the dark. For most of her life, that sound had comforted her. It meant the queens were alive. It meant the workers had found their way home. It meant the world still had order, even when people did not. But now the sound felt heavier. Not because it had changed, because she had. Hive 43 was no longer Harold's favorite mark in an old book. It was no longer the strong colony Clayton wanted to own. It was Mercer Yard. It was a family June had barely known. It was a bee yard that had vanished from the valley after the bad spring, leaving behind empty pallets, a sold house, and a name people stopped saying because saying it made the official story uncomfortable. Daniel came in just before dawn. He had Earl's envelope in one hand and 2 cups of coffee in the other. He looked older than he had the day before. "I opened it," he said. June did not scold him. He set the coffee down and laid the contents beside the ledger. There were 6 names written on a sheet of extension office stationery. Mercer, Bell, Alvarez, Boone, Langford, Pike. Beside each name was a yard number, an estimated hive count, and a column marked relief issued. Daniel tapped the last column. "Mom," he said, "some of these payments didn't go to the beekeepers." June pulled the paper closer. Mercer Yard 86 hives lost relief issued to Regional Orchard Association. Bell Yard 41 hives lost relief issued to Contractor Reserve. Alvarez Yard 62 hives lost pending, then crossed out. Boone Yard 19 hives lost weather, ineligible. She read the names slowly. Each one felt like a person standing in the room. Daniel opened Harold's ledger to the blue cloth marker. "Dad copied some of it here." June leaned over the page. Harold's handwriting began with queen notes: hive temperament, brood strength, surviving stock. But beneath those lines, his records changed. He had drawn a map of the valley in small, careful boxes. Each bee yard marked in pencil, each loss dated, each surviving queen line traced in blue. Hive 43. Mercer survivor. Not Whitaker origin. Do not sell. June sat back. For 7 years, she had carried Harold's command as if it belonged to their marriage alone. She had thought she was protecting the last thing he loved. But Harold had been doing something larger and lonelier than that. He had gathered what survived from everyone else's ruin. Daniel turned another page. There were scraps tucked between the sheets. A gas station receipt from the week Harold drove to Mercer Yard, a handwritten note from Mrs. Alvarez thanking him for taking the last 2 queens before the boxes were burned, and a faded photograph of 3 men standing beside a row of hives June recognized only by their youth. Harold was one of them. Earl Maddox was another. The third man had Mercer written on the back. June touched the photograph. Harold never showed me this. Daniel's voice was quiet. Maybe he thought he was protecting you. June looked at him. Or maybe he knew I would ask why he stayed friends with Earl after this. At 8, Pamela Keene arrived. Not with a folder, with a scanner, a laptop, and the face of a woman who had decided that policy would not be enough. Earl came 10 minutes later. He stood outside the honey house until June said, "Come in or go home." He came in. Pamela spread the documents across the bench. Harold's ledger, Earl's memo, the relief sheet, the lab receipt, the map, the photograph. She did not speak for several minutes. Finally, she said, "This was not just a bad report." Earl looked at the floor. "No." Pamela's voice hardened. "Relief funds were redirected." Earl nodded once. Chemical exposure was minimized. Another nod. And small operators were blamed for inconsistent management so the Orchard Association could keep the contractor and avoid liability. Earl closed his eyes. Yes, the word did not explode. It fell. That made it worse. Daniel gripped the edge of the bench. "You let my father carry that alone?" Earl looked at him, and for once did not hide behind age. "I did." "Why?" Earl's mouth trembled. "Because I was 34, scared, and stupid enough to believe that if the biggest orchards went down, the whole valley would go with them. They told us everyone would lose. Packers, truckers, seasonal crews, stores, families. They said the beekeepers could be helped quietly later." "Were they?" Daniel asked. Earl shook his head. Pamela looked at the relief sheet again. "Helped quietly means erased." June felt the words settle into Harold's ledger. Erased. That was the thing Harold had fought. Not just the spray, not just the dead bees, not just the money. The erasing. The way a dead hive became weather. The way a broken family became poor management. The way a man like Harold became sentimental because the official record needed him to be wrong. June opened the final section of the ledger. She had avoided those pages for years because Harold's handwriting grew weaker there. Some lines wandered. Some words faded where his hand had dragged across the ink. But the last page was clear. "June, if this line survives, it is not ours alone." She stopped breathing. Daniel leaned closer. Harold had listed names beneath the sentence. Mercer, Bell, Alvarez, Boone, Langford, Pike, Whitaker. 7 families, 7 bee yards, 7 queen lines folded, saved, crossed, and carried forward through 22 winters. At the bottom, he had written one more line. "If they come for the queens, make them remember who owned the loss." June pressed her hand to her mouth. For years, she had repeated only what Harold said aloud in the bedroom. "Don't sell the queens. Make them remember." But the ledger held the part he had been too weak to say. They were not only proof, they were inheritance. Not the kind that belonged to one widow, one son, one old house with a bad roof. The kind that belonged to people whose names had been taken out of the story. Outside, a truck door slammed. Clayton Voss had arrived with Marlene Price. No one had called them. That meant someone had told them. Pamela stepped toward the honey house door. "This is not a public meeting." Marlene looked past her at the documents on the bench. "If company materials are being discussed, Hawthorne has an interest." June stood. "No," she said. "You have a fear." Clayton's eyes flicked to the ledger. "Mrs. Whitaker, I strongly advise against making accusations based on incomplete records." June looked at Earl. "Are they incomplete?" Earl's face was pale, but this time he did not look away. "No," he said. "They are not complete, but they are true." Marlene's expression changed just enough for June to understand. Hawthorne had not come to learn. They had come to contain. Daniel moved beside his mother. For the first time since he had brought the buyer to her kitchen, he stood there without asking her to consider the money. Clayton lowered his voice. "June, the offer can still protect you." June thought of the roof, her eye, the tax letter, the check that could soften the last years of her life. Then she looked at Harold's final page. Who owned the loss? She understood now. If she sold the queen line, she would not only sell bees. She would sell the last living thread connecting those families to what had been taken from them. She closed the ledger. "No," she said. Marlene's mouth tightened. "You may regret that." June looked past her to the hives outside, where bees moved in and out of the morning light, carrying pollen from blossoms Hawthorne had nearly lost. "I already know regret," June said. "It sounds like men saying weather when they mean poison." No one spoke. Pamela picked up the relief sheet and placed it in a protective sleeve. "I'm opening a county review," she said. Marlene turned sharply. "On what authority?" Pamela looked at Earl, then at June, then at the ledger. "On the authority of records that should have been opened a long time ago." June walked to the doorway. Beyond the honey house, Hive 43 sat in the first row, patched, faded, and alive. For years, she had guarded it as Harold's command. Now she saw it differently, not as something to keep, as something to return. Pamela Keene did not open the county review with a speech. She opened it with copies. By noon, Harold's ledger pages had been scanned, numbered, and placed beside Earl Maddox's memo, the lab receipt, the relief sheet, and the old valley map Harold had drawn by hand. Pamela made 3 sets before anyone told her not to. One stayed with the county. One went to the state agriculture office. One she sealed in an envelope and handed back to June. "Do not let this become the only copy again," she said. June held the envelope against her chest. For the first time in years, Harold's work felt less like a burden and more like something that had finally found other hands. Hawthorne Fruit Company tried to slow everything down. Marlene Price requested a private review. Clayton Voss asked for context before public interpretation. A statement arrived by email saying Hawthorne respected local agricultural history and remained committed to responsible pollination partnerships. Pamela read it once, then placed it upside down on her desk. "History does not need respect after people are dead," she said. "It needs correction while somebody can still be named." The first person named was Earl. He came to the county office the next morning wearing a clean shirt and the face of a man walking toward weather he had earned. June did not sit beside him. Neither did Daniel. Earl sat alone at the conference table, while Pamela set a recorder between them. His affidavit took 43 minutes. He confirmed the preliminary lab memo. He confirmed that chemical exposure had been discussed before the final report was issued. He confirmed that pressure came from the old Orchard Association and from a spray contractor whose business would have collapsed if liability had been acknowledged. He confirmed that small beekeepers were described as inconsistent operators to weaken their claims. Then Pamela asked about the relief funds. Earl's voice broke there. "They told us the money would stabilize the valley," he said. "They said the larger association could distribute support faster than individual claims. Did that happen?" Earl looked at June for the first time. No. June did not look away. It would have been easier if Earl had been a monster. Monsters could be hated cleanly. Earl was worse. He was a frightened man who had made a cowardly choice and then lived long enough to watch that choice become other people's poverty. When the affidavit ended, Earl pushed a folded paper toward June. It was not an apology letter. It was a list. Names, he remembered. Families Harold had not found. 2 addresses. 1 married name. 1 son who might still live in Springfield. 1 daughter who had written the extension office twice before giving up. "I should have helped him," Earl said. June looked at the paper. "Yes," she said. Earl closed his eyes. Then she took the list. That was not forgiveness. But it was work. Daniel began making calls that afternoon. At first, he did it because June's eyes were tired and the print was small. Then he kept doing it because every call made his father clearer. Some numbers were dead. Some people had moved. Some children did not want to talk about old bees, old farms, or old losses that had already hardened into family silence. But some did. Mrs. Alvarez's granddaughter answered on the 3rd try. "My grandmother kept a smoker on her porch until she died," the woman said. "She said Missouri owed her bees an apology." Daniel wrote that down. The Bell family still had a receipt for hive boxes sold at auction. The Langfords had a photograph of their bee yard before the spray. Travis Boone's father had been a boy when his grandfather's small yard failed. Travis, who had laughed at June in the county office, drove to her house that evening without his seed cap. He stood by the fence, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't know Boone Yard was ours," he said. June watched him struggle with the shame of having mocked the very record that held his own family's loss. "Most people don't know what was taken from them," she said. "That's why records matter." Travis nodded once, then asked if he could help move supers the next morning. June said yes. Daniel looked at her after Travis left. "You let him off easy." "No," June said. "I gave him something heavier than being embarrassed." "What?" "Ayob." 2 days later, families began arriving at the honey house. Not crowds, not reporters, just people with shoeboxes, envelopes, old photographs, auction tags, handwritten receipts, and memories that had never been invited into the official record. A woman from the Mercer family brought a black and white picture of her father standing beside Hive Yard 2. She touched Hive 43 with 2 fingers and cried without making a sound. June stood beside her but did not speak. There were moments when words would only steal space from what grief was finally allowed to do. Clayton came near sunset with Marlene and a new proposal. This one had better language. Community partnership, historical acknowledgement, voluntary support fund, long-term pollinator resilience initiative. June read the first page and handed it to Pamela. Pamela read only halfway before looking up. No public correction? Marlene's expression tightened. We are not prepared to accept liability for predecessor organizations. Daniel stepped forward. But you were prepared to buy the Queen line and the records. Clayton's face reddened. June looked at the proposal again. You want the valley to heal without admitting who was cut. Marlene said, we want a practical solution. June closed the folder. Then here is one. The Queen line would not be sold. The surviving stock would be placed under a pollinator cooperative, with breeding rights held collectively by the named families and current small growers willing to follow open records. Hawthorne could lease pollination support at fair rates, but not own the queens, not rename the line, and not restrict access. A fund would be established for pollinator recovery, small beekeeper training, and legal review of unpaid claims. And before any agreement was signed, the county would issue a corrected historical notice naming the failed report. Clayton stared at her. That is not how these agreements usually work. June thought of Harold's weak handwriting on the final page. No, she said. That's why this one might. Earl signed first, not because anyone trusted him most, but because he owed the most. Daniel signed as witness. Pamela signed as county reviewer. Then the Mercer woman signed with a shaking hand. Others followed. June was last. She paused before writing her name. Daniel stood beside her. Mom, he said softly. I'm sorry. She looked at him. He did not rush to explain. He did not say he had only been worried, though that was true. He did not say he had not known, though that was also true. I thought Dad left you a burden, he said. I didn't understand he left you a way to give something back. June's eyes filled, but she kept her hand steady. We both misunderstood him, she said. Then she signed. Outside, as evening settled over the honey house, the bees moved through the last light in quiet lines. Not owned, not saved for display. Working. 1 year later, the honey house still leaned. Daniel had tried to straighten it twice. Each time, June told him to stop before he ruined its personality. But the roof no longer leaked. That was Daniel's doing. He had replaced the rusted tin with new panels, kept the old east window, and rebuilt the porch step wide enough for June to stand on without testing her balance first. He had also painted the door, the same faded blue Harold once used to mark Queen lines, though June pretended not to notice for 3 days. The sign beside the lane did not say museum. It did not say memorial. It read, Larkspur Pollinator Cooperative. Whitaker Honey House Open Records, Open Stock. Underneath, in smaller letters, were 7 family names. Mercer, Bell, Alvarez, Boone, Langford, Pike, Whitaker. June had fought against putting her name last. Daniel said Harold would have laughed and told her to quit arguing with proper order. So she let it stay. The cooperative was not grand. It had no marble plaque, no ribbon-cutting photograph framed in the courthouse, no display case where children pressed their noses to glass. It had workbenches, veils on hooks, queen cages sorted by year, a coffee pot that burned everything after noon, and young people learning that bees were not equipment. They were agreements. With weather, with flowers, with patience, with truth. Hawthorne Fruit Company still existed. Clayton Voss still wore polished boots and spoke in careful sentences. But Hawthorne no longer owned the story it had tried to buy. Under the county correction and the cooperative agreement, the company paid into a pollinator recovery fund each season it used valley bees. It could lease hives. It could request placement. It could not own the Queen line, rename it, seal the records, or pretend the old report had never happened. Marlene Price had made sure the final language protected Hawthorne from accepting every old liability. Pamela Keene had made sure the correction named enough truth that no one could bury the rest without leaving fingerprints. Earl Maddox came to the honey house every Wednesday. No one asked him to. At first, he came with papers. Then with names. Then with old addresses, forgotten claim numbers, and once, a photograph he had kept in a box for 30 years because he had been too ashamed to throw it away and too afraid to return it. June never told him he was forgiven. But one morning, when his hands shook too badly to pour coffee, she poured it for him. That was as much grace as either of them knew what to do with. Daniel changed too. Though not in the sudden way stories sometimes pretend people change. He still worried over bills. He still checked the weather app before trusting his mother's knees. He still muttered when June lifted anything heavier than a veil. But every Saturday, he came before sunrise. He learned to light a smoker properly again. He learned which hives disliked cloudy mornings. He learned that Hive 43 should be approached from the side, never from the front, and that strong did not mean gentle. The first time he heard a queenless hive before opening it, he stood very still. June saw Harold in his face then, not because Daniel looked like him, because, for one brief second, he was listening like him. Her eye surgery happened in October. Not both eyes. Not everything fixed. Life was rarely that generous. But enough. The cooperative fund covered what Medicare and Daniel could not. When June came home, she could see the east window clearly for the first time in years. She stood inside the honey house and cried because the wax flakes on the shelf were brighter than she remembered. The Mercer granddaughter, Elise, became the first apprentice. She was 16, narrow-shouldered, impatient, and afraid to admit she was afraid of bees. June liked her immediately. On her first day, Elise showed up wearing brand-new gloves and boots too clean for farm life. June almost laughed, remembering herself behind Harold's truck all those years ago. Instead, she led the girl to Hive 43. "Don't watch all of them at once," June said. "You'll only scare yourself." Elise swallowed. "What do I watch?" June took her hand and placed it gently against the side of the hive. "Don't watch first," she said. "Listen." The wood was warm beneath their fingers. Inside, the colony moved with a low, steady sound. Elise's eyes changed. June knew that look. It was the first moment a person understood that an old box could hold more than insects, more than honey, more than work. It could hold a memory that refused to die. Across the yard, Daniel was repairing a stack of inner covers with Travis Boone. Pamela stood near the lane, speaking with two small growers about registration forms that now included space for handwritten lineage notes. Earl sat under the shade with the old ledger open, copying names slowly so his shaking hands would not blur them. The apple trees beyond the fence were in bloom again. This time, when Hawthorne's trucks came, they stopped at the cooperative sign and waited for Daniel to wave them in. June watched bees lift from the hives and cross the morning light in steady lines. For years, people had called them Harold's bees. Then June's burden. Then Hawthorne's solution. But they had never belonged to any of them completely. They belonged to the beekeepers who had lost their yards, to the families whose names had been crossed out, to the blossoms waiting without knowing who had fought for them, to the truth Harold had kept alive long enough for someone else to hear it. June placed Elise's hand closer to the hive wall. "Do you hear that?" she asked. The girl nodded. "What is it?" June smiled toward the orchard, where the first bees entered the white flowers. "That," she said, "is what remembering sounds like."